Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Today is a momentous day because we are putting forth the first ever example of an actual subject condensed into Elon Musk's Semantic Learning Tree model. Now, if you recall, a few weeks ago I did a video, which you can see in this card up here, explaining the method and drawing upon the explanation of this accelerated learning method from other videos as well. But all over the internet, no one has actually taken the trouble of taking any subject and putting it into this type of structure so that someone's learning of this subject could be 10 or 100 times faster and more efficient, particularly when all the necessary elements to help this occur exist over the internet already. And therefore, as far as I know, this is the first such video. Now, we're choosing as our first subject paleontology. Now, I happen to know enough about at least 40 different subjects to make a tree like this, and eventually we're going to have trees for more practical subjects such as personal finance, careers, and high technology. But the reason we're starting with paleontology first is it is a subject that falls into this structure easily. It is a subject where most mainstream people have the opposite problem, which if you saw from the video that I had in the card a little bit earlier, is that they have memorized too many sticks, but they don't have any trunk on which to pile those sticks. And it's a subject that is not very controversial. There's not a lot of people who are going to get very emotional about one subtle dispute of paleontology that exists somewhere, which is not the case in a subject like political science or economics. So we start with paleontology, and that's not a reason to ignore this video. In fact, the subject chosen is the least important part of this video. I just want people to see whether this tree method actually works for them, because I want other people to create other trees and also allow me to keep improving my trees. This happens to be a first attempt at a tree. This video is not going to be as good as the videos we're using in 2024 because innovation is an iterative process. A lot of people don't realize that. They expect an innovator to produce a finished product at first attempt, and then they will criticize the innovator for not producing the finished product, even though the critic is never someone who has done an iota of innovation in their whole life and therefore doesn't know what innovation really is or how the process actually unfolds. So if you're not interested in paleontology, don't fret, because paleontology and evolution is one of the subjects that is essential to learning the accelerating rate of change, which is also important to your day-to-day life. It's important for matters of finance. One of the reasons that I was able to discover the connection between technological progress and exponentially rising amounts of quantitative easing and how the two offset each other and how economic growth is itself exponentially progressing is because of my knowledge of the accelerating rate of change, which also makes sure that someone knows a tremendous amount about paleontology and evolution. The establishment in a lot of fields is relatively clueless about their own field because they don't understand the accelerating rate of change, and that applies to paleontology as well as history, as well as to finance and economics. Okay, this video is an important part of one's holistic understanding of the accelerating rate of change, which is also what can make you very wealthy in your real life here in 2021. So don't think that paleontology has no relevance to that, because it is part of one's holistic understanding of this all-important but supremely under-discussed subject. And one last thing about this tree is that this is a video that is going to be much longer than the standard YouTube video. And maybe YouTube isn't the ideal medium for this type of tree, but that also is something that we will figure out as we go. This is meant to be an entire course for an entire subject, and it refers to many other free resources available on YouTube, Wikipedia, and elsewhere. And hence it is a framework to a much larger body of information. So please see it as such, and I encourage everyone to watch this entire video and tell me if this leads to a much faster and more robust understanding of this particular subject. And yet again, I mentioned don't fixate on the fact that it's paleontology, because we will have videos about a variety of other subjects as well through the practice we get from creating this first tree in this first subject. So now with that introduction, we go to the actual tree. So let me hide my face. If you watch that introductory video, you will know that the trunk is the essential part of the tree, and the most important subjects have to be in the trunk. And as you get to branches, you get to secondary subjects, and if you get to smaller branches, you get to tertiary subjects. And when you get to the smallest twigs and leaves, only the peripheral subjects should be discussed. And the problem is, as I said before, a lot of people just memorize a lot of the peripheral twigs and leaves and therefore have no foundation. You may watch some Hollywood movies that make you familiar with a few dinosaurs, but those are dinosaurs that are selected only because of extreme size or extreme appearance and therefore usefulness to the plot of a Hollywood movie. This will not give you a holistic understanding of paleontology or evolution. It will just lead to a number of memorized factoids. So we begin with this accelerating rate of change. How many processes are always accelerating? This is extremely important because everything from biology to technology to economics all are mutually reinforcing through this. Ray Kurzweil produced this chart about 15 years ago, and so it's a little out of date, but it's still the most comprehensive representation of the accelerating rate of change. The time before the present in the horizontal axis is logarithmic. 10 years from present, 100 years from present, all the way up to a billion years from present, 10 billion years from present. And the vertical axis is the time between the next major event. And then they have a variety of sources, everything from astronomers to popular science to historians to encyclopedias to paleontologists to philosophers, everyone. And this is comprehensive enough so as to not be rigged and to prevent any selective cherry picking of data. And it has been found that all significant events are on an accelerating curve and are always closer and closer to each other. And the gradient of this accelerating curve is in fact pretty constant. And therefore we can anticipate major changes at shorter and shorter intervals, and that is what we are seeing in our modern lives as well here in 2021. Remember, this chart is current as of 2005 or so. I hope that Mr. Kurzweil has an updated chart in his upcoming book. But you have to accept the accelerating rate of change as pervasive in so many different things, because only then will you understand evolution and paleontology, and will realize why certain phenomena in paleontology occurred at the time that they did, and the intervals of time between significant events are what they are. So as we go back to the tree, so the key is to understand the accelerating rate of change in all ways. If you've never heard about this before, it'll take you a fair amount of time to learn about that. But everyone who is interested in anything about the past or the future has to consider the accelerating rate of change, because otherwise there is no foundation to any of those fields that I mentioned, including paleontology. Then the second core level item that belongs in the trunk is geological eras. So we go to an image to represent that. The Earth began 4.5 billion years ago, and life began shortly thereafter, as soon as the Earth cooled enough that liquid water could form into pools. Most of that 4.5 billion years was only very simple life, single-celled organisms, very few multi-celled organisms at all. In fact, from 4.5 billion years ago until about 541 million years ago, the most advanced creature to have ever lived, as per what we know so far, was something that looked like this. It's not a vertebrate. We don't even understand its body structure. It looks pretty primitive, but it took almost 4 billion years to get to this point because, again, this is the accelerating rate of change. This creature is called Dickinsonia. So this was the most advanced creature before 541 million years ago. So as you can see here, as we got to the Paleozoic period, remember, this is the only remaining time, 541 million years to present, that excludes the first 4.5 billion years. So we ignore 4 out of the 4.5 billion years, or to be precise, 88% of the time elapsed since life began on Earth, and explode that out into this bar on the right-hand side, the Paleozoic era. 541 million years ago, we had something called the Cambrian explosion, which we'll discuss, but that was when the diversity and sophistication of life took a jump higher, but that was entirely predictable under the accelerating rate of change and the exponentiality. And the Paleozoic era was the first of the big 3 eras. The Mesozoic era was another era after that, the one where the dinosaurs lived. And the Cenozoic era, which started 66 million years ago, is the one we are presently in. But just be familiar with these eras and how there are periods within these eras. These are all the periods within these individual eras, which we'll talk about. So we go back to the tree. So those are the geological eras. Then you want to study the sequence of evolutionary traits. Now, what does that mean? Once something evolves, it never goes away. It's just more sophisticated things evolve after that. For example, those single-celled creatures eventually became multi-celled creatures. Some became even sophisticated relative to other multi-celled creatures, like that Dickinsonia creature that we talked about, which again was the most advanced form of life that had ever existed prior to 541 million years ago. But things like the ability to breathe air, a vertebral column, the ability to fly, the ability to survive in freezing temperatures. These are all traits that did not exist in the beginning, but evolved over time. Sentience also evolved over time, human intelligence, and we'll talk about that. The sequence of evolutionary traits falls into a very elegant predictability under the accelerating rate of change. When did creatures have 2 eyes? When did creatures get teeth? When did fishes evolve? When did land creatures evolve? And so forth. And this will tie into the next thing I talk about, and I'll go to some charts about that, which is the trendline reversion post-extinction events. So I go to another image to elucidate both the sequence of evolutionary traits and trendline reversion post-extinction events. So the Cambrian explosion was over here. There was very little complexity to life before that point, 541 million years ago. Even after that, it didn't rise that much until you get to a point well into the Paleozoic era, to this period, which is now when you get an explosion of fishes. Why? Because fishes are vertebrates. They didn't have mouths even at the beginning, but eventually they got jaws and they got eyes that function the way we think of eyes as functioning. And fishes were the most common thing in the world. Life didn't start on land until even somewhat later, this Silurian period, Devonian period. And then you have things like amphibians, which come from fishes. These are amphibians. Notice how the types of fishes went away because there was an extinction event between the Permian and Triassic period, which we'll talk about. And then there was another smaller extinction event between the Triassic and Jurassic periods within the Mesozoic. And there was the age of reptiles, dinosaurs. Yes, Hollywood would have you believe that the entirety of prehistoric life was dinosaurs, but not really. It was a large portion for a long period of time, but look at this bulge over here that puts into context how important dinosaurs were, and my cursor is circling the era and variety of dinosaurs relative to the age of fishes, which few people know about, or even the age of amphibians, which was not insubstantial. And then you had another extinction event, the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, which was much more famous than the one between the Permian and the Triassic, even though the Permian-Triassic event was larger. And as many people know, dinosaurs went extinct, and a lot of reptile types went extinct. The only types that survived are what we see here: crocodiles, snakes, turtles, and so forth. Certain types of small two-legged dinosaurs became birds, so we see birds here. But the vacuum vacated by the dinosaurs enabled mammals, which did exist for many tens of millions of years before the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, but then mammals proliferated. And these are the approximate breakdown that we see today. Fishes still exist. There are a lot of types of fishes in the world, small minnows all the way up to the largest sharks. Amphibians still exist, but they're the most diminished. There's not many types of amphibians, and most of them are quite small. Reptiles do exist, but they're much smaller and in much less variety than they were at the time of the dinosaurs. Birds exist, but again, they're not very large. Even the largest birds are not all that large at the end of the day, but they do represent the direct descendants of dinosaurs. And mammals are by far the most dominant, not only in numbers, counting humans, but these little branches are based on species. There are more species of mammals than every other type of creature, partly because mammals are the most suited for cold climates as well. And evolution to exist in cold climates only happened relatively recently on an evolutionary time scale. So you can see how all these pre-fish invertebrate type creatures existed before the Cambrian explosion, and even somewhat after the Cambrian explosion. It still took a couple 100 million years for there to be significant life on Earth, because plants had to adapt to living on land before there was even enough oxygen in the atmosphere for animals to go live on land. Fishes once had a time when they were the dominant creature in the world. There was almost no type of creature other than fishes. There was a major extinction event between the Permian and Triassic periods, which marks the boundary between the Paleozoic and Mesozoic eras that we saw. Amphibians became huge during that time, but then even they were displaced by reptiles because reptiles could live further away from the water than amphibians could. The age of reptiles gave rise to dinosaurs. Again, the things people learn just by watching Hollywood films are encompassed within what I'm circling over here. And then the all-important Cretaceous and Paleogene extinction event. But every time there was a big extinction event, since life was not wiped out totally, you had a complete bounce back because the trend line of complexity of evolutionary features and the trend line of intelligence was never broken. After the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event 66 million years ago, almost every type of tetrapod creature, four-legged creature, larger than 25 kilograms died off. Only turtles and crocodiles survived. Every other type of tetrapod creature, other than those two, above that minimal size, died off. But that didn't break the trend line because all those vacant ecological niches were filled very quickly by mammals, and the bounce back was extremely fast. The bounce back took a very short time because there was a whole empty world to repopulate. And some reptiles still existed, of course, and descendants of dinosaurs became birds, but mammals then filled in all types of niches that used to be filled in by dinosaurs. And to study extinction events in their entirety, go to the Wikipedia page for extinction events. It'll be in the description box below. And you can look at how long ago certain extinction events were and the magnitude of the extinction that had occurred. So 0 is present, and going leftwards is amount of time in the past. You can see the Permian-Triassic extinction event, which I talked about, was the most pervasive and dramatic of all. It's the one that came closest to ending all life on Earth, and you can click on the link for that and read about that. That's the beauty of Wikipedia. You have these tools available at the click of a button. The much more famous Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event is this one over here. And I have a video about trendline reversions after extinction events, which you can see in this card up here at the top that just flashed in the upper right hand corner. But this was 66 million years ago. It represented the extinction of the dinosaurs and a number of other large creatures. It was not nearly as pervasive as the Permian-Triassic extinction event, as we can see here. It just happens to be much more famous for reasons of which types of creatures that we find interesting. But to study extinction events, this is a very good resource. And you can click on even the other ones if you want, but these two are the most important ones because they are the central elements to the major turning points and reversions back to the trend line within paleontology. So we go back to the tree. So we saw the three big eras after the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion was a one-time event that marked the beginning of a new age, and that started all of the Paleozoic. But the three big branches here are the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Just referring back here again, Paleozoic is blue, Mesozoic, which started after that Permian-Triassic extinction event, is the orange, and Cenozoic, which started after that Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, is the yellow over here. So to study the Paleozoic, we will go to periods within the Paleozoic, and then the various clades of creatures. What is a clade? A clade is one of the supergroups of animals. For example, going to primates, even though primates had nothing to do with the Paleozoic, they came much later. Primates are a clade. Within that you have lemurs, you have monkeys, you have lesser apes, and you have great apes like gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. So clades are a supergroup at a certain level. And when you go back to Paleozoic clades, you have to study the various types of Paleozoic clades. So in going through individual periods, if you take the Cambrian period, which is the first period of the Paleozoic era, which was 541 million years ago, starting with that Cambrian explosion, all the way up to 485 million years ago, and therefore a duration of 55 million years, you can scroll down the Wikipedia page and see some of the typical creatures of the Cambrian period. Not that fascinating, but then you can learn about each clade and understand each of these individual creatures. You don't have to memorize each creature, just learn about the clade. Going to the next period after that, and the good thing about Wikipedia is you can just click on this. So this is the Cambrian period. The next one, the Ordovician period, 485 million years ago to 443 million years ago, therefore 41.6 million years in duration. You go further down, you see a picture of all the creatures that existed in the ocean in the Ordovician, and you see these squid-like things that have shells, and you can learn about the clade. You don't have to worry about each individual creature. And you go that way down through all the periods. After the Ordovician is the Silurian period, which is 443 million to 419 million years ago, and therefore 24.6 million years in duration. This was, incidentally, when there was the very first life on land. And they'll have a picture of the primary creatures of the Silurian. And you don't have to memorize each one of these. Again, just get an idea of the clade within each period. The next one is the Devonian. The Devonian was from 419 million to 358 million years ago, spanning 60.3 million years, so a pretty long period. Interestingly, in the Devonian, you can see the evolution of vertebrates in this chart, which was similar to the other chart that we saw before, but you get some idea that Devonian was when there was a major expansion in the variety of creatures. As with all such periods, you can go down and see pictures of what the creatures were during that time. One of the largest creatures in the entire Paleozoic era was this armored fish, Dunkleosteus, that was about the size of a killer whale and had sharp teeth and a fully bony armored head, for example. But that's an individual species. Don't fixate too much on that. That's a twig or a leaf in the whole tree. Focus only on the periods and the clades. Since the Devonian was the time when plant life proliferated on land, you have a nice painting of what it looked like at that time. So yes, finally there was a jungle or a swamp that was on land, and you started to get life going on land. And just progressing through, after the Devonian was the Carboniferous period. Most of the coal that we have in the world today is from the plants of this time. And you do the same thing. This is some artwork about what it looked like at that time. These were some of the big creatures there, terrestrial invertebrates. This was the age of gigantic insects and scorpions and so forth. The fish were very exotic, as you can see. The first amphibians, tetrapods. And the final period is the Permian, right after this. 299 million years ago to 251. 47 million years in duration. Reptiles began. There were a lot of amphibians here. These were the primary creatures of the Permian. And the Permian, of course, ended with that Permian-Triassic extinction event. So back to the tree. Now you know how to look through all of that with Wikipedia. So you have the Cambrian explosion as the start of the Paleozoic, the periods within the Paleozoic, the clades of creatures, and then to the extent of your curiosity, you can go into families and subfamilies of creatures such as armored fish or giant amphibians or whatever if you want, and only then worry about individual creatures. So that is the story of the Paleozoic. We talked about how the Paleozoic transitioned to the Mesozoic because it was the biggest extinction event of all time. The extinction event that came closest to eradicating all life on Earth, it was 252 million years ago. The Paleozoic ended with the Mesozoic, as we can see from this chart over here. So now we're over here, Paleozoic ending into Mesozoic. Back to the tree. And we go to the Mesozoic. Now, most mainstream people's knowledge of paleontology, what little there is, focuses on this era because this is the age of the dinosaurs, and therefore this is where people who watch Hollywood movies learn whatever little they might know about paleontology. But in our process of going to the Mesozoic, since we want a holistic and scientific understanding of paleontology, we go through the same process that we did with the Paleozoic, which is looking at individual periods, recognizing that dinosaurs existed in this era, but then focusing on clades. Don't just memorize a certain famous dinosaur without understanding the evolutionary tree that it came from. Sure, there was a Tyrannosaurus as an individual creature, but it was part of a family of other theropods, some of which were smaller than it, less impressive and therefore less famous. And it was part of a larger clade, a larger superfamily of creatures as well. And only by understanding this do you understand even which dinosaurs are somewhat closely related to each other, which are not related to each other, and so forth. So the same process. We go to the Mesozoic, and so back to Wikipedia. As the Permian ended, we go to the Triassic. So now we're in the Mesozoic. The Triassic period was from 252 million years ago to 201 million years ago, a duration of 50 million years. And we scroll down. These are the primary creatures of the Triassic. So you can be familiar with their clades and just recognize which types of creatures emerged for the first time. And that is something understood at the clade level, not at the individual creature level. Looking at one creature without understanding who its ancestors were and where it deviated from the more primitive supercategory of creatures or more primitive clade of creatures is why people don't understand when a certain creature evolved, why it evolved, and what niche it occupied. Once you know enough about paleontology, you can see a picture of a creature, and even without it having any label telling you what its name is, you will know exactly where within the evolutionary timeline it fit. So that was the Triassic period. There was a smaller extinction event at the end of the Triassic, marking the boundary between the Triassic and the Jurassic period. The Jurassic period was 201 million years ago to 145 million years ago, and therefore about 55 million years in duration. And this was a time of certain famous types of dinosaurs. Not all of the famous types of dinosaurs, but certain types of famous dinosaurs. And you can scroll down and learn a little bit about those as well. You go to the next period, the Cretaceous period, which is the final period of the Mesozoic era. And it is itself about 79 million years in duration. So it went from 145 million years ago, the end of the Jurassic, to 66 million years ago. The Cretaceous period was in fact longer than the time elapsed since the end of the Cretaceous to the present. The former is 79 million years, the latter is just 66 million years. And you can scroll down and understand the various clades. Yes, these are dinosaurs that might be familiar to you. Some of these are birds, the earliest birds. But don't memorize something Tyrannosaurus rex just because Hollywood made it famous. Don't memorize Triceratops just because Hollywood made it famous. Understand the clade and then the superfamily and the family and then the individual. So we'll go to Tyrannosaurus rex. Kingdom animal, obviously, phylum Chordata. Clades, dinosaur, Saurischia, and theropod. It is a theropod dinosaur. Some theropods are very small. Other theropods are extremely large, such as Tyrannosaurus. Learn this clade and then see its evolutionary tree. Tyrannosauridae is a subset of theropod dinosaurs, and within that you have multiple dinosaurs. You have Tyrannosaurus rex as the biggest one, but then you have some that are a little bit smaller than it, and therefore much less famous, because why would Hollywood ever show the third largest one when it could show the largest one? But Tyrannosauridae is a family. If you click on this, and you can do this for far less well-known or glamorized creatures as well, but then you can see what the larger families are. So if you go to theropod, for example, going back to clade, you'll see a picture that represents many types of theropods. Some very large, some small, but hey, why is this owl here? This is a modern owl. This is something that exists today. It is a descendant of the theropod clade, just like large theropods similar to Tyrannosaurus are. Tyrannosaurus itself is part of the same clade as these birds. And you go to the theropod clade. Theropods, you have smaller types of dinosaurs. You have neotheropods. You have other subfamilies and families. You get to larger dinosaurs, and you see a certain type of Tyrannosaurus-like dinosaur appear a few times. They're part of different families, but all with a common ancestor. And then you see how birds come into being. Coelurosauria is in fact the superfamily of which Tyrannosauridae that we were talking about is a subset. You see Tyrannosaurus over here as an image, but you also see ordinary birds like this pigeon, for God's sake. It is related to Tyrannosaurus because both are part of this Coelurosauria family. Now you can do this with a whole bunch of other creatures. We chose Tyrannosaurus just because it's famous. But ultimately, as someone who's truly interested in science, you shouldn't just be interested in the creatures that are well known or the most extreme, because Hollywood chose to display them for a very obvious reason. True inquiry would understand that entire tree of the clade and the family that we talked about. So that was the Mesozoic era. So we go back to our tree, the three periods within the Mesozoic: Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Dinosaurs. There are clades of dinosaurs. Theropods is one clade. Within theropods, there were many types of theropods. And within the families of theropods, you saw there was one that turned into Tyrannosaurus, another that just turned into ordinary birds like pigeons and sparrows and owls. Look at it within that context, and then you will greatly accelerate your understanding of this subject rather than just memorize a few creatures because you saw them in a movie. And that distinguishes between someone who just knows a few things because they saw them in a movie versus someone who has a fully holistic understanding of paleontology. So that was a Mesozoic. And then we get to the final of the three eras, and the era that is currently going on, which is the Cenozoic. There are periods within the Cenozoic, just like there were periods within the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. But guess what? The first thing we studied was the accelerating rate of change. And we saw that periods were all 50, 60 million years long in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. That's no longer pragmatic in the Cenozoic, because the Cenozoic only started 66 million years ago. Because of the accelerating rate of change, the rate of evolution has sped up, and they have divided individual periods into epochs. Now, periods within the Mesozoic are also divided into epochs, but that is too fine of a parsing to really be that relevant until you get really advanced. In the Cenozoic, epochs really matter because under the accelerating rate of change, a lot can happen in just 10 million years, whereas in the past, the big changes were 50 million years apart. Go back to Ray Kurzweil's chart that we saw at the beginning of this video. So within the Cenozoic, we go through a similar process, but we'll also deviate and add something special on top because we're going to talk about the evolution of intelligence, and that should be understood within the context of the accelerating rate of evolution, the epochs, the clades, the families and subfamilies, and the environmental adaptations and convergent evolution that the Cenozoic really brings to the front because of the rate of evolution that we now see closer to the present. So as the Cretaceous goes into the Paleogene, which is the first period of the Cenozoic, the Paleogene is too big to ultimately leave unparsed as a period. Therefore, we go to the division smaller than a period. Remember, eras are divided into periods. Periods are divided into epochs. Paleocene is an epoch. And the Paleocene started 66 million years ago with that Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, which was the extinction of the dinosaurs, and ended 56 million years ago, meaning it was 10 million years in duration. This 10 million years was governed by a vacant world that was being repopulated by the few creatures that survived the mass extinction. And you can see the various animals. There was a giant bird like this. There was a large herbivorous mammal like this. So this was just the recovery period from that extinction event, but how things reverted back to the trend line. There was more complex life than ever before, and the most intelligent creature on Earth was more intelligent than the most intelligent creature in the prior period, the Cretaceous. But this epoch was 10 million years. Then you go to the next one, the Eocene, which was from 56 million years ago to 33.9 million years ago. So about 22 million years in duration. Now this is when life has fully repopulated the Earth and is diversifying and becoming more sophisticated very quickly. These are all the fossils around life of the Eocene, because now we're getting closer to the present. Now from the Eocene epoch, we go to the next one, which is called the Oligocene. And the Oligocene was from 33.9 to 23.03 million years ago, or about 10 million years in duration. And this is an opportunity to remember something that we saw earlier, which is that you can always go to Google and type in XYZ life for any period or epoch. And we did this much earlier in the video, but you can do this for the Oligocene, just as an example. Oligocene life in Google Images, and you'll see all this artwork, and it will inform you a lot about creatures, families, and clades. So this is how you can cross-reference visually against a time frame, and just do that selectively so that you get a general flow how the visual aspect of evolution is progressing. So after the Oligocene, we go to the Miocene epoch over here. The Miocene is actually the first epoch of a new period, the Neogene, but that's fine. We're only focused on epochs at this point. Miocene was from 23 million years ago to just 5 million years ago. So we're getting closer and closer to the present. The beginning of the Miocene to the end of the Miocene was 18 million years, which was a much longer time than from the end of the Miocene to present, which was only 5.3 million years. And as with everything, you can scroll down and learn more about the Miocene. The next one was the Pliocene epoch. Pliocene, 5.3 million years ago to just 2.58 million years ago. So notice how short each of these epochs is even getting. We knew that periods were too long in a duration to keep a block of time 50 million years long this close to the present. So we have epochs, but even the epochs are getting shorter and shorter because of the accelerating rate of evolution and how more and more sophisticated creatures are emerging in a shorter and shorter time. This is the Pliocene now. As with many Wikipedia articles about a certain epoch, they will have some nice artwork about what life existed then. You had creatures like this in the Pliocene. In the Americas, you had things like this in just North and South America. We're not even talking about the Eastern Hemisphere, but this is what you had in the Pliocene. And this is close enough to the present that the continents look like what they did today. The continental drift that occurred was in the Mesozoic and Paleozoic eras, but now we're too close to the present that continental drift is a large factor in evolution anymore. As the Pliocene ended, you go to the Pleistocene, which was from 2.58 million years ago to just 0.0117 million years ago, meaning 11,700 years ago. This is the last truly prehistoric epoch, and the world didn't look that different than what it was today. These were some of the animals of the Pleistocene. There were ice ages there, but now these are also somewhat famous creatures. The woolly mammoth, the American lion, the woolly rhinoceros, and it ended just 11,700 years ago. And you can read about this as much as you want and go into the links in Wikipedia and go all the way to the last one, the Holocene, which is the one we are in right now. It started 11,700 years ago, up to present, and it is the age of humanity. Modern humans already existed 11,700 years ago, but the first civilization came into being. And if you want to understand how this video goes seamlessly into my instructional video about world history, I encourage you to see this card up here in the upper right hand corner, where I created a video that speeds up how people learn about world history. However, that does not use the tree method. I make a new video that formats world history into the tree method, and the handoff of this Holocene period into world history therefore goes from here. Now, through the periods and the epochs all the way up to the present, we go back to the tree for some cross-sectional study. Okay, so now we went through a chronological timeline. That alone isn't all of paleontology. You have to consider environmental adaptations. Why did mammals return back to the water? Mammals were on land. They evolved on land and went into the water. That's the reverse of what amphibians and fish did. Fish were in the water, they came on land, and they evolved into amphibians. Now you have a land creature, mammals, that have gone back to the water and they became whales and other cetaceans. Reptiles also were on land and went back into the water in the Mesozoic era. But then you also have convergent evolution, which transcends Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and in some cases even Paleozoic evolution. You have a creature like the Ankylosaurus, which has a same type of body format as a mammal, the Glyptodon, even though the Ankylosaur is a reptile from the Mesozoic, and the Glyptodon is a mammal from the Cenozoic, and in fact from the very late Cenozoic. They are not related to each other at all, but the software of evolution, which has not only accelerating rate of change, but a lot of memory of successful adaptations, leads to convergent evolution. One of the best examples of convergent evolution is in the aquatic shape that has been used by reptiles, fish, and mammals, all because it is convenient. Take the shark, which has evolved 420 million years ago. And this is why Wikipedia is very convenient, because just going to this type of large group will tell you when it actually began. It began in the Ordovician period. The shark has a certain body shape. The shark is a fish, and specifically it's not even a bony fish. It has only cartilage, so it is a type of fish that was earlier than the bony fish, but it's so successful at what it does that it still exists today, even though it survived 2 separate extinction events that we talked about earlier. But you also go to now reptiles, ichthyosaurs. The ichthyosaur is a reptile, but it has a shark-like body shape because that was convenient for living in the water. So even though it's not related to sharks at all, it's a reptile that has bones, whereas the shark is a fish that had just cartilage. They still converge to the same shape despite not being related at all. And you know where I'm going to go with this. Even mammals have converged to this shape. Dolphin. This is what a dolphin looks like. They, of course, exist today. They are the descendants of mammals that lived on land and went back into the water. And they still converge to that same shape that we saw in sharks and ichthyosaurs for the most part. So that is convergent evolution. And there are smaller examples of convergent evolution that we can go through. But knowing about this will connect a lot of dots for you in terms of how the evolutionary process works and how the software of evolution that is embedded into all life has a memory of various shapes, and therefore adaptation to a suitable shape happens faster and faster because it was proven out in the past by a creature that was extinct long before dolphins ever even existed. That was ichthyosaurs, as a reptile. Sharks have been around for even longer, as we saw, but sharks are so successful that they still exist today. And dolphins are, of course, from cetacea, which we see from all cetaceans, and cetaceans first emerged 53.5 million years ago, which was the Eocene period. And you can look this up for any type of creature. Getting too far into this gets you into the leaves and twigs of the tree, but when you want to cross-check this with what you learned about the chronology of all evolutionary periods, then the entire tapestry comes into place. So we talked about convergent evolutions, of which there are many examples, environmental adaptations, such as creatures now live in polar climates and they have become white. Bears became white because they live there. Foxes became white. Even cetaceans like the beluga whale became white because they're in a polar environment. And of course you can do the same thing as long as you cross-reference clades, families and subfamilies, and individual creatures across environmental adaptations and convergent evolution. All of this starts to make a lot of sense. Now, before we go to the evolution of intelligence, I'm going to give you a few more resources that will provide another cross-sectional reference to enable greater solidification of everything you've been learning. Here is a video from someone named Dane Pavitt that has an animation of marching dinosaurs. and it has 27 million views, and it's very useful for educational purposes if you have gone through a tree as I have described. Now, these dinosaurs are not organized by clade or family. They're just in ascending order of size. So each one is larger than the previous one. It just gets larger and larger until you get to the largest dinosaur of all. Watching this video before you have an understanding of the evolutionary eras and periods, and before you have gone into the clades and subfamilies, will be very confusing. But watching it after you have a familiarity there will enable you to name a lot of these creatures without even there being any labels. Now, there are other videos with labels as well, so you can look at that. But this provides some animation to all the knowledge you have accumulated, and provides also a proper reference of hierarchy between size and therefore the various clades. Now, for example, what you're seeing over here is the largest type of dinosaur, which are the long-necked sauropods, and also one of the most well-known types. They comprise all of the various largest types of dinosaurs, so they are last in this video. And if I speed this up along, you get to bigger and bigger ones relative to the size of this person who is almost too small to see. Now, what are the names of all these sauropods? You will know this automatically by going through the tree as I have gone through, and memorizing the individual names is not that important, even though these are the largest terrestrial creatures that have ever lived, and among the largest to have ever lived in any environment. You have to approach this from the tree method so as not to get bogged down in an individual creature, and then a resource like this is much more powerful than if you watched this first without going through the tree. So the same guy has also made a video about Cenozoic animals, so we will go there. So this is a video by the same person about Cenozoic mammals, so no dinosaurs, and of course they're not as big as dinosaurs, but this is very educational after you go through the tree and you understand the clades, the families and subfamilies, and only then explore individual creatures, as well as understanding convergent evolution and how similar body shapes can often emerge among creatures that are not closely related at all, and in some cases are very distantly related. For example, this gigantic rhinoceros that you see over here has a similar body shape as ceratopsian dinosaurs such as Triceratops. That is convergent evolution because these two things are not closely related at all. So these videos are very educational and are an essential tool after you have gone through the tree method, and now we're trying to cross-check a lot of the leaves and twigs across the thicker branches that you have already learned about. And there'll be links to this in the description box below. Now, lastly, we get to the evolution of intelligence. I have a video about that you can see in this card in the upper right-hand corner. But in addition to that, I want to connect that to this evolutionary tree. So under the accelerating rate of change, this is now the evolution of intelligence. Here is a chart of brain size in the vertical axis and millions of years from the present. Now, as we saw, the modern era, the Holocene, only began 11,000 years ago, and the Pleistocene only began 2.5 million years ago. So this is Holocene, Pleistocene, and all the way up to here. In fact, this is Miocene up here. So Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene, and Holocene. It took 4.5 billion years to get to Sahelanthropus as a creature, which is the common ancestor of both chimpanzees and humans. And modern chimpanzees are very similar to Sahelanthropus. So the chimpanzee represents another creature that was part of the evolutionary trend, but then plateaued where it is. The chimpanzees of today are probably no more intelligent than the ones of 5 million years ago, because evolution created new creatures that left them behind. And you can see each of these has a bigger and bigger brain. And you could extend this chart in the left-hand direction to get to 4.5 billion years ago, and you will not find any sentient intelligence or use of significant tools until very recently. Now we're talking only millions of years ago. And then something happened 1.7 million years ago. The brain size started to rise in an accelerating way. And then 0.7 million years ago, just 700,000 years ago, you got something even bigger and more advanced. And only very recently, we're talking 100,000 years ago or something like that, you had the two large-brained hominid creatures who were the most intelligent creatures to ever evolve on Earth, Homo neanderthalis and Homo sapiens. Neanderthals went extinct, Homo sapiens are what we are. But notice this accelerating rate of change and how this is not surprising when you understand the accelerating rate of change going back 4.5 billion years. The brain size tripled. The body size didn't rise that much, in some cases not at all, but the brain size tripled. Seemingly nothing was happening for a huge amount of time, and then suddenly in a very short time the brain size just tripled. And this process has not stopped. This is when human intelligence merges with technology, when the physical constraints, the biophysical limits of the human brain are being reached. And this is going to happen within the 21st century itself, but that video card that I had a couple of minutes ago will tell you more about that. This was not some magical thing that occurred because of some outside influence. This was just the accelerating algorithm of evolution finally reaching this point. So it's very analogous to the Cambrian explosion, which was 541 million years ago. But that was when the exponential trend created very visible results. And the evolution of modern intelligence and sentience was also when the exponential trend created very visible results. And this has to be viewed within that context when studying paleontology and evolution. Now you can look up all these creatures on Wikipedia. There are even animations on YouTube that kind of do a time-elapsed facial animation of how Sahelanthropus got to modern humans. You can see all the intermediate steps, not just 4 or 5 intermediate steps, but all of them. And that can give you an idea of how we got from Sahelanthropus all the way to Homo sapiens. And there's tons of these resources online. The key is the tree will tell you what to look for. When you get to a certain point in the tree, whether it's an era, whether it's a clade, whether it's an aspect of convergent evolution or adaptation, whether through Wikipedia, YouTube, or anywhere else, you will know exactly where to go. And this is how the tree method can make you learn a seemingly large subject in a very short time. So we go back to the tree. And with that, we conclude this tree, because this is a pretty long video by YouTube standards, but we're trying to do something revolutionary over here. I believe that if you spend just 1 hour a day studying in a method that I outlined based on this tree, within 60 days you'll know a tremendous amount about paleontology. I don't think there's more than 500 people in the world who are earning a living by being full-time paleontologists. Although there was one very famous television character who was a paleontologist. Only one paleontologist outside of a show about paleontology. But this tree will enable you to know more than almost anyone other than those 500 people about this subject. Just 1 hour a day for maybe 60 days, so 60 hours total, that's all it will take. So this concludes our first tree, and again, you have to start somewhere. This will have a lot of iterations, and there will be trees of other subjects, but I want this to be the first tree that we do, because I believe education should be far more accessible, and teaching methods should in fact be far more accelerated. And I'm someone who teaches at one of the best universities in the world, Stanford University, and I have been thinking about this problem for a very long time, because even at Stanford, it is classroom-based instruction. It's just a more prestigious classroom and a higher caliber teacher, such as myself and other colleagues there. But otherwise, it's a low-tech method. I believe we have the resources to hack all of this because of what is available on the internet today. It just requires this type of structure, which Elon Musk says works very well for him, but nobody has bothered to make these trees. I wanted to be the first. And this will create, in fact, something analogous to a Cambrian explosion of education and knowledge, because the current methods of education are expensive, they don't scale, and are very, very outdated, and are not serving society very well, particularly when we now have things that we just did not have when I was a kid. You had to go to the library and check out books, and if the books didn't have something that was in fact what you wanted to find out about, you just were stuck until you went to the library the next time. And in my case, my parents had to take me to the library because I was 9 years old. And at least I was fortunate enough to be in a country that had good public libraries. Most people in the world don't live in countries that have good public libraries, but the internet is much more accessible than that. So let this be the first tree, and let this tree hopefully be the start of a Cambrian explosion of knowledge across many subjects. Other subjects I will do a tree for include astronomy, finance, engineering, and many, many more. And we're a small community over here. This channel has 600 subscribers. That is not a huge number, of course, but that is enough to get a community going and for at least there to be more exposure for a tree, because I want input about this tree, and I want other people to be inspired to create their own trees so that everyone makes better and better trees, and there are multiple types of trees as well across more and more subjects. So let this revolution begin now. And with that, I hope you see the possibilities here. And if you like this type of content and you want to encourage the production of these types of trees, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel and bring exposure to this tree and others that I create. Thank you very much for watching.